Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little different. We're diving into the darkest corners of human history, not the battlefields or the throne rooms, but something far more intimate and terrifying. The diseases that hunted us, the plagues that emptied cities, the illnesses that turned bodies inside out, the epidemics that made people more afraid of their neighbors than of any army. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world at 3 a.m, at midnight, during that strange hour when sleep won't come and the mind starts wandering into history's darker hallways. Now, settle in. Maybe adjust your pillow, turn on that fan for some white noise, dim the lights. Tonight's journey is going to be uncomfortable, yes, but in that strange way that makes you grateful for the body you have right now, the medicine cabinet in your bathroom, and the fact that you live in an age where a fever doesn't automatically mean writing your will. We're going to walk through smallpox, the plague, leprosy, tuberculosis, cholera, and more. Not to horrify you, but to understand them, to see how fragile human civilization has always been, and how every generation before ours lived under the shadow of invisible killers they couldn't understand, couldn't cure, and often couldn't escape. These weren't movie monsters or fictional horrors. They were microscopic realities that shaped empires, ended dynasties, and rewrote the genetic code of entire populations. So, breathe, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because if you think your day was hard, wait until you hear what your ancestors survived, just to give you the chance to be here, listening to this, right now. Congratulations, you've just arrived in October 1348. The good news is, you're in one of the great trading cities of Europe, bustling with merchants, spices, and silk from the east. The bad news is, you're about to witness the greatest catastrophe in human history. The Black Death has arrived, and it's traveling faster than rumor, faster than prayer, and far faster than any medieval understanding of medicine could possibly hope to stop it. It started quietly, as most nightmares do. Ships pulled into the harbour at Messina, Sicily, carrying goods from the Crimea, but when the ropes were tied and the gangplanks lowered, something was immediately horrifyingly wrong. Most of the sailors were dead. The ones still alive were covered in black boils, delirious with fever, coughing blood onto the docks. Within days, they were dead too. And within weeks, so were half the people who had welcomed them ashore. The disease spread with terrifying speed, from Sicily to mainland Italy, from Italy to France, from France to Spain, to England, to Germany, to Scandinavia. By 1350, it had reached as far north as Iceland and as far east as Russia. Nowhere was safe. Not the countryside, not the cities, not the monasteries where monks prayed for salvation and died anyway. 3 and 4 to a shared grave. The plague had 3 forms, each more horrifying than the last. The most common was bubonic plague, named for the buboes, swollen lymph nodes that appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. These weren't just lumps. They were agonizing, egg-sized masses of infection that turned black and oozed pus. Victims burned with fever, their bodies racked with chills, their skin breaking out in dark purple blotches from internal bleeding. The fingers and toes turned black from gangrene as blood vessels collapsed. It looked like the body was rotting from the inside out, and, in a way, it was. If you caught bubonic plague, you had maybe a 60% chance of dying, and you had about 3 to 5 days to find out which side of that statistic you'd land on. There was no treatment. Doctors tried bloodletting, which only weakened patients further. They tried lancing the buboes, which spread infection. They burned aromatic herbs, thinking bad air caused the disease. They prescribed potions made of crushed emeralds, powdered unicorn horn, and other expensive nonsense that did absolutely nothing except bankrupt the desperate. But bubonic plague wasn't the worst form. That honor belonged to pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs. This version spread through the air when infected people coughed, which meant you didn't need a flea bite or contact with a sick person's belongings. You just needed to be in the same room, breathing the same air. Pneumonic plague killed in 1 to 2 days, sometimes less. You'd wake up feeling fine, develop a cough by noon, start spitting blood by evening, and be dead by morning. It was mercifully fast, but that speed also meant it raced through households, wiping out entire families before anyone understood what was happening. And then there was septicemic plague, the rarest and most lethal form. This occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. There were no buboes, no warning signs, just sudden, catastrophic organ failure. Victims turned black almost immediately as their blood coagulated under the skin. They died within hours, sometimes before anyone even realized they were sick. This form had a 100% mortality rate. If the plague reached your blood, you were already gone. The death toll was incomprehensible. In 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, the Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. In Europe alone, somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire population died. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields went unplowed. Bodies piled in the streets because there weren't enough living people left to bury the dead. In some cities, mass graves were dug and corpses were stacked in layers, sometimes hundreds deep, covered with lime to slow the smell and the spread. The social fabric tore apart. Some people turned to religion, forming groups of flagellants who marched from town to town, whipping themselves bloody to atone for humanity's sins and beg God for mercy. Others turned to scapegoating, blaming Jews for poisoning wells, which led to horrific pogroms and massacres across Europe. Still others simply gave up, deciding that if death was inevitable, they might as well drink, feast, and sin until the end came. Priests died trying to give last rites. Doctors fled. Families abandoned their sick loved ones out of sheer terror, leaving them to die alone in locked rooms. And the plague didn't just kill, it reshaped everything. With so many dead, labor became scarce and valuable. Peasants who survived could demand higher wages. The feudal system began to crack. Art turned dark, obsessed with death, skeletons, and the dance macabre. Medicine began, slowly, to question old authorities like Galen and Hippocrates. The Renaissance, in a strange way, was born from the ashes of the plague, as survivors looked around at the ruins and decided to rebuild something new. What people didn't know, couldn't know, was that the Black Death was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on black rats. The rats travelled on ships, in grain stores, in the walls of homes. When a flea bit an infected rat and then bit a human, the bacteria entered the bloodstream and began to multiply. The rats died too, which only made things worse, because when their host died, the fleas looked for new victims. That's why the plague spread so efficiently through densely packed medieval cities, where sanitation was non-existent and rats were everywhere. It would take centuries before humanity understood this, and even longer before antibiotics like streptomycin and tetracycline made plague treatable. Today, if you catch plague early, you'll probably survive. In 1348, you simply waited to see if God had marked you for death, and most of the time, he had, is less than #0. 7 hash is greater than. If the Black Death was humanity's most dramatic catastrophe, smallpox was its most persistent nightmare. For at least 3,000 years, this virus stalked every continent, every civilization, every generation. It didn't come in waves like plague. It simply never left. And when it finally did leave, it wasn't because it got tired. It was because humanity, for the first and only time in history, hunted a disease to complete extinction. Smallpox was caused by the variola virus, and it came in 2 main forms. Variola major was the monster, killing around 30% of those it infected. Variola minor was kinder, if you can call a 10% mortality rate kind. But whether you got the major or minor version, if you survived, you carried the scars forever. And I mean that literally. The disease started innocuously enough. A fever, body aches, maybe some vomiting. For 2 or 3 days, you'd feel like you had a bad flu. Then the rash appeared. It started in your mouth and throat, small red spots that quickly became sores. Within a day, the rash spread to your face, then your arms, then your entire body. And this wasn't just a rash. These were pustules, raised bumps filled with thick, opaque fluid that felt like BBs embedded under the skin. The pustules were everywhere. On your face, your scalp, the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, inside your mouth, your throat, even your eyes. Imagine trying to swallow with your throat, lined with painful sores. Imagine blinking when your eyelids are covered in pustules that could rupture and scar your corneas, leaving you partially or completely blind. Around 20% of survivors lost their vision. Many more lost patches of skin as the pustules scabbed over and fell off, leaving deep, pitted scars that marked them for life. The worst cases were called hemorrhagic smallpox or blackpox. In these victims, the pustules merged into sheets of bleeding tissue. The skin turned dark purple or black as blood vessels ruptured throughout the body. Internal organs bled. Death came quickly, usually within a week, and it was almost always fatal. Fortunately, this form was rare, occurring in less than 3% of cases. But when it appeared, it was unmistakable and terrifying. Smallpox didn't discriminate. It killed peasants and kings with equal enthusiasm. Pharaoh Ramses V of Egypt likely died of smallpox around 1157 BCE. His mummified face still shows the telltale scars. Queen Mary II of England died of it in 1694. Emperor Joseph I of Austria in 1711. King Louis XV of France in 1774. The list goes on and on, a royal body count that spans millennia. But smallpox's most devastating impact came when European colonizers brought it to the Americas. Indigenous populations had no immunity. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, they brought guns, horses, and smallpox. The guns and horses were terrifying. The smallpox was apocalyptic. Within a century, an estimated 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas had died, most from disease rather than warfare. Entire civilizations collapsed. The Aztec Empire fell not just to Hernán Cortés, but to the epidemic that swept through Tenochtitlan in 1520, killing the emperor and decimating the population. In some cases, smallpox was used deliberately as a biological weapon. During the French and Indian War in 1763, British officers discussed distributing blankets from smallpox patients to Native American tribes. There's documented evidence that this happened at Fort Pitt, where blankets from the smallpox hospital were given to Delaware tribe representatives during a siege. Whether this was the primary cause of the subsequent outbreak is debated, but the intent was clear and horrifying. For thousands of years, humanity had no real defense. In China and India, people practiced variolation, a technique where scabs from smallpox patients were ground into powder and blown into the nostrils of healthy people, or where pus from a mild case was scratched into the skin. This often produced a milder infection and subsequent immunity, but it was risky. Around 1 to 2% of people who underwent variolation died from the procedure itself. Still, those odds were better than the 30% mortality rate of naturally acquired smallpox. Everything changed in 1796 when an English doctor named Edward Jenner made a critical observation. Milkmaids who had caught cowpox, a mild disease from cattle, seemed immune to smallpox. Jenner took pus from a cowpox sore on a milkmaid's hand and scratched it into the arm of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. The boy developed a mild fever but recovered quickly. 6 weeks later, Jenner exposed him to smallpox. Nothing happened. The boy was immune. Jenner had created the world's first vaccine, though the term wouldn't be coined until later. The word comes from vacca, Latin for cow. Vaccination spread slowly at first, meeting resistance from those who feared the procedure or distrusted the science. But over the next century, it became clear that vaccination worked. Smallpox deaths plummeted wherever vaccination programs were implemented. By the 1950s, smallpox had been eliminated from North America and Europe, but it still raged in parts of Africa, Asia, and South America. In 1967, the World Health Organization launched an ambitious global campaign to eradicate smallpox entirely. Teams of doctors and health workers traveled to the most remote corners of the planet, vaccinating millions and tracking down every last case. It was an unprecedented effort, requiring international cooperation, massive funding, and the dedication of thousands of workers who risked their own lives to stop the virus. The last naturally occurring case of smallpox was diagnosed on October 26, 1977, in a hospital cook named Ali Mau Malin in Somalia. He survived. 3 years later, on May 8, 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated. It was the first and still the only human disease to be completely wiped from the planet. Today, the only known samples of variola virus exist in 2 high-security laboratories, one at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta and one at the Vector Institute in Russia. There's ongoing debate about whether these samples should be destroyed or kept for research. For now, they remain the last remnants of a virus that killed an estimated 300 million people in the 20th century alone. Smallpox is gone, but its legacy remains in the pockmarked faces of elderly survivors, and in the principle it taught us that with enough determination, science, and global cooperation, humanity can fight back against even the oldest, most persistent diseases. And sometimes, we can win completely. Of all the diseases that have terrorized humanity, leprosy might be the most misunderstood. It didn't kill quickly like plague or smallpox. It didn't sweep through populations in devastating waves. Instead, it did something arguably worse. It took people who were alive, healthy, and part of their communities and turned them into ghosts, living exiles. People forced to announce their own presence with bells so others could flee before coming too close. The disease we call leprosy, known medically as Hansen's disease after the Norwegian physician Gerhard Hansen, who identified the bacterium in 1873, is caused by Mycobacterium leprae. It's a slow-growing bacteria that primarily attacks the nerves, skin, and mucous membranes. And here's the thing most people get wrong. Leprosy doesn't make your flesh rot and fall off. That's a myth, born from fear and medieval imagination. What it actually does is far more insidious. The bacteria targets the peripheral nerves, the ones that carry sensation from your skin to your brain. As these nerves are damaged and destroyed, you lose feeling in your hands, feet, and face. At first, it might just be a patch of skin that feels numb. You might not even notice. But over months and years, that numbness spreads. And when you can't feel pain, you can't protect yourself from injury. Imagine cooking and not feeling the burn when you touch a hot pan. Imagine walking with a stone in your shoe all day and not realizing your foot is bleeding. Imagine scratching your face and not knowing you've cut yourself until you see blood on your fingers. Without pain to warn you, injuries accumulate. Cuts become infected. Bones in the fingers and toes can be reabsorbed by the body after repeated unnoticed trauma, making them appear to shrink or disappear. This is where the myth of rotting flesh came from. The tissue wasn't rotting. It was being damaged over and over because the person couldn't feel it happening. Leprosy also caused visible deformities that medieval people found horrifying. The bacteria could damage facial nerves, causing paralysis that made it difficult to blink. Without blinking, the eyes dried out, leading to blindness. The nose could collapse as the cartilage was damaged. Fingers curled into claw-like positions as tendons shortened from nerve damage. Feet developed ulcers from walking on numb soles. The voice could become hoarse as the bacteria affected the vocal cords and nasal passages. But the physical damage, as terrible as it was, paled compared to the social death that came with a leprosy diagnosis. The disease has been mentioned in texts dating back thousands of years, and almost universally, it was associated with divine punishment, moral corruption, and uncleanliness. In the Bible, people with leprosy were considered ritually impure and had to live separately from their communities. In medieval Europe, being diagnosed with leprosy meant undergoing a ceremony that was essentially a funeral for a living person. The church performed a ritual called the separation of lepers. The person would be brought to church, made to kneel in a symbolic grave, and have dirt thrown on them while prayers for the dead were recited. They were given a wooden clapper or a bell and a specific set of clothes that marked them as a leper. From that moment on, they were legally dead. They couldn't inherit property, couldn't marry, couldn't enter most towns or churches. If they walked on a road, they had to stay downwind of healthy people and ring their bell or clapper to warn others of their approach. Leper colonies became common throughout Europe and Asia. These weren't medical facilities. They were exile communities, often just a collection of huts outside city walls where people with leprosy were sent to live out their remaining years. Some colonies were managed by religious orders who provided basic care. Others were simply places where society's outcasts were abandoned to fend for themselves. In Hawaii, in the 19th century, people diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly sent to the Kalaupapa Peninsula on Molokai, a remote piece of land surrounded by ocean cliffs on 3 sides and mountains on the 4th. It was a prison without walls, because there was nowhere to escape to. The cruelty wasn't just institutional, it was personal and intimate. Families turned away their own children, spouses, parents, people with leprosy were stoned, beaten, driven from villages. They were blamed for their condition and treated as moral failures rather than medical patients. The stigma was so powerful that it persisted long after effective treatments were discovered. What made this even more tragic was that leprosy was never as contagious as people feared. It spreads through prolonged, close contact with untreated individuals, likely through respiratory droplets, but it requires repeated exposure. Most people, about 95%, have natural immunity and will never develop the disease, even if exposed. Medieval quarantine measures were based on terror, not transmission risk. The breakthrough came in the 1940s with the development of dapsone, the first effective antibiotic against leprosy. Later, multi-drug therapy combining dapsone, rifampicin, and clofazimine could cure the disease completely if caught early. Today, leprosy is entirely treatable. If you start treatment before significant nerve damage occurs, you can be cured with minimal, lasting effects. The World Health Organization provides free treatment to anyone in the world who needs it. But even now, in the 21st century, leprosy hasn't disappeared. There are still over 200,000 new cases diagnosed each year, mostly in India, Brazil, and Indonesia, and the stigma lingers. In some countries, people with leprosy still face discrimination, even though they're not contagious once treatment begins. Laws that once mandated isolation have only recently been repealed in many places. In Japan, forced isolation wasn't ended until 1996. The story of leprosy is less about bacteria and more about human cruelty in the face of fear. It's about how we treat people when they're different, when they're sick, when they remind us of our own vulnerability. The disease attacked nerves and skin, but society attacked dignity and humanity. And, in many ways, that second attack left deeper, more lasting scars. There was a time, not so long ago, when dying of tuberculosis was considered almost romantic. Poets wrote about it. Artists painted pale, ethereal figures wasting away in candlelit rooms. The disease was called consumption because it seemed to consume people slowly from within, hollowing them out until they were translucent, fragile, beautiful in their decay. But there was nothing beautiful about coughing up blood for months, losing weight until your bones showed through your skin, or drowning in your own lungs while your family watched helplessly. Tuberculosis, caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis, has been with humanity for at least 9,000 years. Scientists have found evidence of TB in the spines of Egyptian mummies and in Neolithic skeletons. For most of human history, it was simply part of life, a slow death that could take years to complete its work. And unlike plague or smallpox, which came in terrifying waves and then receded, tuberculosis was always there, killing steadily, quietly. The disease most commonly attacks the lungs, though it can infect any part of the body: bones, kidneys, spine, brain. When someone with active pulmonary TB coughs, sneezes, speaks, or even sings, they spray tiny droplets containing the bacteria into the air. Another person breathes them in, and the bacteria settle into the lungs. In many cases, the immune system walls off the infection, creating small calcified nodules called tubercles. The bacteria remain dormant, sometimes for decades. You're infected, but not sick. This is called latent TB, and roughly 1/4 of the world's population has it right now. But when the immune system weakens due to malnutrition, stress, age, or another illness, the bacteria can reactivate. They begin to multiply, destroying lung tissue and creating cavities, literally holes in the lungs. This is active TB, and this is when the symptoms begin. A persistent cough that lasts weeks, then months, chest pain, fever and night sweats so severe you'd wake up drenched, your sheets soaked through. Weight loss, dramatic and unrelenting, as your body burned through calories trying to fight the infection. And eventually, hemoptysis, coughing up blood. The blood started as streaks in the sputum, then became clots, then sometimes gushed out in terrifying hemorrhages as the bacteria eroded blood vessels in the lungs. People would cough into handkerchiefs, hiding the evidence until the fabric was too stained to hide anymore. In the late stages, they'd become skeletally thin, their cheeks hollow, their eyes huge in their gaunt faces. They'd gasp for breath as their lungs filled with fluid and scar tissue. Death came from respiratory failure, from bleeding, from starvation as the body wasted away, or from the TB spreading to other organs. In the 18th and 19th centuries, tuberculosis killed more people than any other disease. It was responsible for 1 in 4 deaths in Europe. In some cities, 1 in 3 people died of it. It was called the White Plague, both for the pale appearance of its victims and to distinguish it from the Black Death. No one was safe. The poor died in crowded tenements where the disease spread easily. The wealthy died in their comfortable homes, where fresh air and good food offered no real protection. The disease became so common in artistic circles that it developed an almost mystical reputation. John Keats, the Romantic poet, died of TB at 25. His brother had died of it a few years earlier, and Keats nursed him through his final illness, likely contracting the disease then. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, all died young from TB, along with their brother Branwell. Frédéric Chopin, the composer, suffered from it for years before dying at 39. Doc Holliday, the gunfighter of American West fame, had TB and knew he was dying slowly, which might explain his reckless courage. Victorian culture romanticized the disease in strange ways. Tuberculosis was thought to make people more creative, more sensitive, more spiritually refined as they approached death. The physical symptoms, the pallor, the thinness, the feverish brightness of the eyes, became markers of a certain tragic beauty. Women with TB were considered more attractive, more ethereal. Fashion even mimicked the consumption look. Pale skin, slim waists, delicate frames. It was grotesque, really, this aestheticization of a horrible, painful death. Treatment, for most of history, was non-existent. Doctors recommended rest, fresh air, and good food, which helped some people but cured no one. In the late 1800s, sanatoriums were built in mountains and rural areas where the air was clean and cool. Patients were made to rest for months or years, lying on open porches even in winter, breathing cold mountain air. Some improved, most didn't. The sanatoriums were essentially warehouses for the dying, places where families could send their sick loved ones away from the rest of the household. More desperate treatments were tried as the 19th century progressed.
Doctors collapsed the infected lungs surgically, believing that rest would allow it to heal. They removed ribs to allow the lung to deflate.
They filled the chest cavity with air or fluid. These procedures were painful, dangerous, and rarely effective. Many patients died from the treatment itself or from secondary infections. But people were so desperate that they submitted to these interventions anyway, hoping for a miracle that almost never came. The turning point came in 1882 when Robert Koch, a German physician and microbiologist, identified Mycobacterium tuberculosis as the causative agent of TB. It was a monumental discovery, proving that tuberculosis was an infectious disease caused by a specific bacterium, not bad air or hereditary weakness. Koch was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1905 for this work, but identifying the cause didn't immediately lead to a cure. That came in the 1940s with the development of antibiotics. Streptomycin, discovered in 1943, was the first effective treatment for TB. Suddenly, people who would have died were walking out of sanatoriums cured. By the 1950s, combinations of antibiotics like isoniazid and rifampicin made treatment even more effective. Sanatoriums closed. TB wards emptied. The White Plague, which had killed millions for thousands of years, seemed to be ending. But tuberculosis never disappeared. It still kills about 1.6 million people every year, mostly in low-income countries where malnutrition and HIV weaken immune systems and where access to treatment is limited. And now, drug-resistant strains have emerged, bacteria that can't be killed by standard antibiotics. Multi-drug-resistant TB and extensively drug-resistant TB require years of treatment with toxic medications that cause severe side effects. Some strains are virtually untreatable. The romantic disease was never romantic at all. It was just another way for bacteria to slowly destroy a human body while the world watched and called it beautiful. If you thought tuberculosis was a slow death, let me introduce you to cholera, a disease that could kill you faster than you could process what was happening. One moment you'd be healthy, drinking water from the town pump, chatting with neighbors. 12 hours later, you'd be dead, your body so dehydrated that your skin turned blue-grey and your eyes sank deep into your skull. They called it the Blue Death, and it was one of the most terrifying ways to die in the 19th century. Cholera is caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, which lives in contaminated water. You drink the water, the bacteria reach your intestines, and they release a toxin that does something devastatingly simple. It forces your intestinal cells to pump out water and electrolytes at an uncontrollable rate. Your body, which is roughly 60% water, starts hemorrhaging fluid from both ends. And I mean hemorrhaging, not normal diarrhea. Something far worse. The diarrhea of cholera is described as rice water stool because it looks like the cloudy water left over after washing rice. It's watery, pale, and flecked with mucus, and it comes in torrents, sometimes a litre or more per hour. You'd be sitting over a chamber pot or bucket, unable to leave, as your body expelled fluid faster than you could possibly replace it. The vomiting was just as severe. Patients described it as projecting like a fountain, violent and uncontrollable. Within hours, you'd lose so much fluid that your blood volume would drop dramatically. Your blood pressure would plummet. Your heart would race, trying desperately to pump what little blood remained through your body, but there wasn't enough. Your organs would begin to fail from lack of oxygen. Your skin would lose its elasticity, becoming wrinkled and loose, a condition doctors called washerwoman's hands because your fingers looked like you'd been soaking them in water for days. Except you'd actually lost all your water. Your face would become gaunt and skeletal within hours. Your eyes would sink so far back into their sockets that you looked like a living corpse. Your lips and fingernails would turn blue from poor circulation. You'd experience agonizing muscle cramps as your electrolytes, sodium, potassium, chloride, became dangerously imbalanced. These weren't just leg cramps. Your entire body would seize up in painful spasms. And through it all, you'd remain conscious, aware of what was happening, terrified and helpless. The mortality rate for untreated cholera ranged from 25 to 50%, depending on the strain and the victim's overall health. But here's the thing. If you survived the first 24 to 48 hours, you'd probably recover completely. The disease burned through you like wildfire and then was gone. The bacteria didn't invade your bloodstream or destroy your organs directly. They just made you lose water until you died of dehydration and shock. It was brutally efficient. Cholera emerged from the Ganges Delta in India, where it had been endemic for centuries. But in the early 1800s, it began spreading beyond its traditional boundaries. Better transportation, increased trade, and mass movements of people during colonization and warfare carried the disease around the world. The first cholera pandemic began in 1817 and spread through Asia and the Middle East. The second pandemic, starting in 1829, reached Europe and the Americas. By the time the third pandemic hit in 1852, cholera was a global terror. London was hit particularly hard during the 1854 outbreak. The disease swept through neighborhoods seemingly at random, killing hundreds. At the time, the prevailing theory was miasma, the idea that disease was caused by bad air rising from rotting organic matter. So authorities focused on smells, burning tar, and firing cannons to clear the air, which did absolutely nothing to stop the spread. But a physician named John Snow suspected something else. He noticed that cholera cases clustered around certain areas, particularly around the Broad Street water pump in Soho. Snow mapped every cholera death in the neighborhood and found that almost all of them had drunk water from that specific pump. He interviewed survivors and families of victims. He investigated the pump and found that it was located just 3 feet from an old cesspit that was leaking sewage. Snow convinced local authorities to remove the pump handle, making it impossible for people to draw water from that source. The outbreak in that area stopped almost immediately. It was one of the first clear demonstrations of waterborne disease transmission and a founding moment in the science of epidemiology. But Snow's findings were controversial. Many doctors and officials refused to believe that invisible organisms in water could cause disease. The miasma theory was too entrenched. It would take decades before germ theory was fully accepted. In 1883, Robert Koch, the same scientist who had identified the tuberculosis bacterium, traveled to Egypt and India to study cholera outbreaks. He isolated Vibrio cholerae and proved it was the causative agent. He showed that it spread through contaminated water and food, especially in areas with poor sanitation. His work finally provided the scientific proof needed to support Snow's observations and begin real public health reforms. Cities began investing in clean water systems, sewage treatment, and sanitation infrastructure. These weren't just medical advances. They were massive engineering projects that transformed urban life. Cholera deaths in developed countries plummeted. By the early 20th century, cholera had been virtually eliminated from Europe and North America, not through vaccines or antibiotics, but through clean water and proper sewage disposal. But cholera never disappeared globally. It still exists wherever water systems are inadequate, which is much of the world. After earthquakes, floods, or wars that destroy infrastructure, cholera outbreaks follow almost inevitably. Haiti suffered a massive outbreak in 2010 after a devastating earthquake, with over 800,000 cases and nearly 10,000 deaths. Yemen has faced ongoing cholera epidemics since 2016, with over 2 million suspected cases, because war has destroyed the country's water and sanitation systems. The treatment for cholera is remarkably simple: rehydration. Give patients clean water mixed with salt and sugar to replace what they're losing, and most will survive. Oral rehydration solution. A specific mixture of glucose and electrolytes can be given even to patients who are vomiting, because the small intestine can still absorb it. In severe cases, intravenous fluids work even faster. With proper treatment, the mortality rate drops below 1%. Without it, half the patients die within hours. There are now vaccines for cholera, though they're not perfect. They provide partial protection for a few months to a few years. But the real solution has always been the same: clean water and proper sanitation. The diseases that killed our ancestors by the millions can be stopped not with complex medicines, but with the simple infrastructure we take for granted every time we turn on a tap or flush a toilet. Cholera taught us that invisible threats in our water could kill faster than any sword or bullet, and that civilization itself depends on the pipes beneath our feet. If cholera killed you in hours, typhus killed you slowly while destroying your mind along the way. This was the disease of crowding, of filth, of war and desperation. It followed armies across continents, filled concentration camps with corpses, and turned sieges into mass graves. Wherever humans were packed together in misery, wherever lice could spread from body to body without interruption, typhus was there, waiting. Typhus is caused by bacteria called Rickettsia prowazekii, and it spreads through the feces of body lice. Yes, lice feces. Here's how it works. A louse feeds on the blood of someone infected with typhus. The bacteria multiply in the louse's gut. When that louse bites another person, it defecates while feeding, as lice tend to do. The bite itches, so you scratch it, and in scratching, you rub the infected louse feces into the wound. The bacteria enter your bloodstream, and within a week or two, you're sick. The disease started with a sudden high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Your head would pound with a severe, unrelenting headache. Your muscles and joints would ache as if you'd been beaten. Then came the rash, starting on your trunk and spreading outward to your arms and legs. Small red spots that darkened to purple as blood vessels were damaged by the infection. In severe cases, the spots merged into larger patches of hemorrhaging under the skin. But the most terrifying symptom was the delirium. As the infection spread through your bloodstream, it attacked the small blood vessels in your brain. Within days, you'd become confused, disoriented, agitated. You might not recognize your family. You might scream, thrash, try to escape from imaginary threats. The word typhus comes from the Greek typhos, meaning smoky or hazy, referring to the clouded state of mind it produced. You were there physically, but mentally you were lost in a fog of fever and hallucination. Without treatment, typhus killed between 10 and 60% of its victims, depending on the strain and the person's overall health. Death usually came from organ failure, particularly of the heart and kidneys, or from complications like pneumonia or gangrene. If you survived, recovery was slow, taking weeks or months to regain full strength. And even then, you might experience relapse years later, a milder recurrence called Brill-Zinsser disease. Typhus has been documented for centuries, but it became notorious during times of war. Soldiers living in trenches, wearing the same lice-infested uniforms for weeks, sleeping in close quarters. These were perfect conditions for typhus to spread. During the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, more soldiers died of typhus than died in battle. During the Napoleonic Wars, typhus devastated the French army. Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812 with over 600,000 men. He retreated with fewer than 100,000. Typhus killed more of his soldiers than Russian bullets or winter cold. World War I saw massive typhus outbreaks on the Eastern Front, particularly in Serbia and Russia. Millions died. The disease spread so rapidly in overcrowded military hospitals and refugee camps that it became known as war fever and camp fever. After the Cold War, as Europe descended into chaos and millions of displaced people crowded into temporary shelters, typhus continued to kill. In Russia alone, between 1918 and 1922, an estimated 3 million people died of typhus during the Civil War and famine. But perhaps the most haunting association with typhus is the Holocaust. In the ghettos and concentration camps of Nazi-occupied Europe, where thousands of people were crammed into spaces meant for hundreds, where sanitation was non-existent and clothing was never washed, typhus spread unchecked. Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Theresienstadt all saw major typhus epidemics. Anne Frank died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen in February or March of 1945, just weeks before British forces liberated the camp. Her sister Margot died around the same time, likely from the same disease. The Nazis themselves feared typhus and used it as propaganda, claiming that Jews were disease carriers who threatened German health. This justified the creation of sealed ghettos and later helped rationalize the camps themselves as quarantine measures. It was a grotesque inversion of cause and effect. The Nazis created the conditions, overcrowding, starvation, filth, that allowed typhus to flourish, then blamed the victims for being sick. The breakthrough in typhus control came not from a cure, but from an insecticide. In 1939, Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Müller discovered that a compound called DDT was extremely effective at killing insects, including lice. During World War II, Allied forces used DDT powder to delouse soldiers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp survivors. For the first time, typhus could be controlled quickly and effectively. Müller was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1948 for his discovery. DDT was sprayed on millions of people and proved remarkably successful at preventing typhus outbreaks. After the war, as refugees were processed and displaced persons camps were established, DDT dusting stations became standard. People would walk through clouds of white powder that settled on their clothes and skin, killing any lice they carried. It was crude, but it worked. Typhus, which had killed millions during and after World War I, was largely prevented from doing the same after World War II. Of course, DDT came with its own problems. By the 1960s, it became clear that widespread environmental use of DDT was devastating bird populations and accumulating in the food chain. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, published in 1962, helped launch the environmental movement and led to DDT being banned for agricultural use in many countries. But for controlling lice in emergency situations, it remained one of the most effective tools available. Today, typhus is treated with antibiotics like doxycycline or chloramphenicol. Caught early, patients recover completely within days. But the disease hasn't disappeared. Epidemic typhus still occurs in areas with extreme poverty, overcrowding, and lack of sanitation, particularly in parts of Africa and South America. And there are related diseases, like endemic typhus spread by fleas, and scrub typhus spread by mites that cause similar symptoms and require similar treatments. Typhus taught us that disease doesn't respect borders, treaties, or ideologies. It follows human misery wherever it leads. And it showed us that sometimes the most effective medicine isn't a drug or a vaccine, but something as simple as clean clothes, hot water, and enough space between people to keep the lice from marching from one body to the next. Of all the diseases humanity has faced, syphilis might be the most loaded with shame, stigma, and silence. It was called the Great Pox to distinguish it from smallpox, and it terrorized Europe for centuries, not just because of what it did to the body, but because of how it was transmitted. This was a sexually transmitted infection at a time when sex was wrapped in moral judgment, religious condemnation, and social hypocrisy. People died slowly, painfully, and often alone, too ashamed to seek help until it was far too late. Syphilis is caused by a spiral-shaped bacterium called Treponema pallidum. It spreads through direct contact with syphilitic sores during sexual activity, and less commonly through blood transfusions or from mother to child during pregnancy. Once the bacteria enter the body through mucous membranes or broken skin, they begin a slow, methodical destruction that unfolds in stages over years or even decades. The first stage, primary syphilis, begins about 3 weeks after infection. A single sore called a chancre appears at the site where the bacteria entered, usually on the genitals, anus, or mouth. The chancre is round, firm, and painless, which is deceptive. It doesn't hurt, so many people ignore it or don't even notice it. And within 3 to 6 weeks, it heals on its own, vanishing without treatment. But the bacteria don't disappear. They're just getting started. A few weeks to a few months later, secondary syphilis begins. This stage is systemic, meaning the bacteria have spread throughout the body via the bloodstream. A rash appears, often on the palms of the hands and soles of the feet, though it can cover the entire body. The rash doesn't itch, which again makes it easy to dismiss. But accompanying the rash are fever, fatigue, sore throat, swollen lymph nodes, and patchy hair loss. Some people develop wart-like lesions in warm, moist areas like the groin and armpits. These lesions, called condylomata lata, are highly contagious. Like the chancre before it, the symptoms of secondary syphilis eventually resolve on their own, even without treatment. And this is where syphilis becomes truly insidious. The disease goes silent. For years, sometimes decades, the infected person feels fine. They have no symptoms. They might forget they were ever sick. This is called latent syphilis. And during this time, the bacteria are quietly, invisibly damaging internal organs. The heart, the brain, the bones, the blood vessels. Then comes tertiary syphilis, the final stage, which can appear 10 to 30 years after the initial infection. This is when the accumulated damage becomes catastrophic and irreversible. The bacteria form gummas, soft tumor-like masses that can grow anywhere in the body. They destroy whatever tissue they invade. Gummas in the nose and palate could eat through bone, collapsing the bridge of the nose and creating holes in the roof of the mouth. Gummas in the skin left deep, disfiguring ulcers. Gummas in the bones caused fractures and deformities. But the worst damage was internal. Cardiovascular syphilis attacked the heart and major blood vessels, particularly the aorta. The walls of the aorta weakened and bulged, forming aneurysms that could rupture suddenly, causing massive internal bleeding and death within minutes. Heart valves were damaged, leading to heart failure, And then there was neurosyphilis, infection of the brain and spinal cord, which produced some of the most horrifying symptoms of any disease. Neurosyphilis caused tabes dorsalis, a degeneration of the nerves in the spinal cord that led to loss of coordination, stabbing pains in the legs, and an inability to sense where your limbs were in space. People with tabes dorsalis walked with a distinctive stamping gait, slapping their feet down hard because they couldn't feel the ground beneath them. It also caused general paresis, a progressive dementia that destroyed personality, memory, and judgment. People became grandiose, delusional, convinced they were royalty or possessed vast wealth. They lost the ability to speak clearly, to control their muscles, to recognize loved ones. Within a few years, they were completely incapacitated, bedridden, and eventually dead. Syphilis emerged in Europe in the late 1400s, though its origin is hotly debated. Some historians believe it was brought back from the Americas by Columbus's crew. Others think it had existed in Europe all along but mutated into a more virulent form. Either way, by 1500, it was spreading rapidly across the continent. It was called the French disease by Italians, the Italian disease by the French, the Spanish disease by the Dutch, and the Polish disease by Russians. Everyone blamed their neighbors. For centuries, the standard treatment was mercury, administered as ointments, pills, or vapor baths. Patients were shut in small rooms and heated over mercury fires until they salivated excessively, a sign of mercury poisoning that doctors mistakenly thought was therapeutic. The treatment often caused more suffering than the disease: tooth loss, kidney damage, tremors, and death from mercury toxicity. There was a saying, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," referring to the Roman goddess of love and the planet associated with the toxic metal used to treat the disease she allegedly brought. In 1905, German scientist Fritz Schaudin identified Treponema pallidum as the causative agent of syphilis. In 1906, German physician August von Wassermann developed the first blood test for the disease, making diagnosis possible even in asymptomatic patients. And in 1909, Paul Ehrlich and Sahachiro Hata developed Salvarsan, the first effective chemical treatment, though it was toxic and required many painful injections over months. Everything changed in 1943 when penicillin was discovered to be extraordinarily effective against syphilis. A single injection could cure early-stage infection. Even late-stage syphilis could be arrested, though damage already done couldn't be reversed. Suddenly, the disease that had terrorized humanity for half a millennium was curable with a simple antibiotic. But the story of syphilis includes one of the darkest chapters in medical history. From 1932 to 1972, the United States Public Health Service conducted the Tuskegee study, observing the progression of untreated syphilis in 600 African American men in Alabama. The men were told they were receiving free health care for bad blood. They were never informed they had syphilis. Even after penicillin became the standard treatment in the 1940s, the researchers deliberately withheld it to continue observing the disease's natural course. Many men died, their wives were infected. Their children were born with congenital syphilis. The study wasn't stopped until 1972, after a whistleblower exposed it to the press. Today, syphilis is still with us, with rates rising in recent years after decades of decline. It remains treatable with antibiotics, but only if people get tested and treated promptly, something stigma still prevents too often. The Great Pox taught us that shame can be as deadly as any bacterium. If you thought dying of plague or cholera was terrifying, imagine dying of a disease that turned your skin and eyes the color of a sunset. Yellow fever earned its name, honestly. As the virus destroyed your liver, bile would back up into your bloodstream, staining everything a sickly yellow-orange. What came next was far worse. The black vomit, thick and dark with digested blood, the final sign that your internal organs were liquefying. Yellow fever is caused by a virus transmitted by mosquitoes, specifically Aedes aegypti, a species that thrives in tropical and subtropical climates and has an unfortunate preference for human blood. The virus belongs to the flavivirus family, related to dengue and Zika, but yellow fever has always been the deadliest of the group. A single infected mosquito bite was enough to start a chain of infection that could devastate entire cities. The disease began innocuously, like so many others. 3 to 6 days after being bitten, you'd develop a fever, headache, muscle aches, and nausea. It felt like a bad flu. Many people, around 15% of those infected, would recover after 3 or 4 days, their immune systems successfully fighting off the virus. But for the unlucky remainder, after a brief remission where they seemed to be getting better, the disease entered its toxic phase. This was when yellow fever revealed its true nature. The fever returned, higher and more persistent. Jaundice appeared as the liver failed, turning the skin and the whites of the eyes a distinctive yellow. The kidneys began to fail, causing dark urine and eventually complete shutdown. But the most horrifying symptom was the hemorrhaging. The virus damaged blood vessels throughout the body, causing them to leak. Patients bled from their gums, their nose, their eyes. They vomited blood that had pooled in their stomachs, partially digested by stomach acid, giving it a black, coffee ground appearance. This was called vomito negro, black vomit, and it was a death sentence. Internal bleeding continued unseen. The stomach, intestines, and other organs bled into body cavities. Blood pressure dropped. Patients became confused, then delirious, then comatose as their brains were starved of oxygen. Death came from multi-organ failure, usually within 7 to 10 days of the toxic phase beginning. The mortality rate for those who reached the toxic phase was around 50%. There was no specific treatment. Doctors could only provide supportive care and watch as half their patients died despite everything they tried. Yellow fever has likely existed in Africa for thousands of years, but it became globally significant during the age of colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. Ships carrying enslaved Africans also carried Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, which bred in water barrels and bilge water. When these ships reached the Americas, the mosquitoes disembarked along with the people, finding a new tropical paradise where they could thrive year-round. The first documented yellow fever epidemic in the Americas occurred in Barbados in 1647. From there, it spread throughout the Caribbean and into North and South America. Philadelphia suffered a massive outbreak in 1793 that killed around 5,000 people, roughly 10% of the city's population. People fled by the thousands. The federal government, then based in Philadelphia, essentially shut down. Commerce stopped. Bodies piled faster than they could be buried. In the 1800s, yellow fever repeatedly struck port cities along the Gulf Coast and up the Mississippi River. New Orleans, Memphis, and other cities saw regular epidemics that killed thousands and crippled economies. But perhaps the most significant impact of yellow fever was on global politics and engineering. In the 1880s, the French attempted to build a canal across Panama to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It was an ambitious project led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, who had successfully built the Suez Canal. But Panama was not Egypt. Panama was a hot, humid jungle filled with mosquitoes. Yellow fever and malaria tore through the workforce. Workers died by the thousands. Some estimates suggest that over 22,000 people died during the French effort, most from disease rather than accidents. The project became known as the greatest medical disaster of the 19th century. By 1889, the French company was bankrupt, and the canal project was abandoned, defeated not by engineering challenges, but by invisible viruses carried in mosquito saliva. When the United States took over the project in 1904, they approached it differently. A military physician named William Gorgas, who had successfully controlled yellow fever in Havana after the Spanish-American War, was put in charge of health measures. Gorgas understood something revolutionary for the time. Yellow fever was spread by mosquitoes. This had been proven just a few years earlier by American physician Walter Reed and his team, who conducted experiments in Cuba that definitively linked Aedes aegypti to yellow fever transmission. Gorgas launched an aggressive campaign to eliminate mosquitoes from the canal zone. His teams drained swamps, covered water containers, poured oil on stagnant pools to kill larvae, fumigated buildings, and installed screens on windows and doors. They even placed the legs of hospital beds in pans of water to prevent ants from climbing up, which inadvertently created mosquito breeding sites until someone thought to add oil to the pans. It was meticulous, exhausting work, but it succeeded. Yellow fever cases dropped dramatically. The canal was completed in 1914, a triumph of engineering made possible by controlling disease. In 1937, South African virologist Max Theiler developed the first effective yellow fever vaccine, a live attenuated virus that provided long-lasting immunity. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1951 for this work. The vaccine was safe, effective, and relatively inexpensive, and it could be manufactured in large quantities. Mass vaccination campaigns were launched throughout tropical regions where yellow fever was endemic. Today, the vaccine remains one of the most effective ever created. A single dose provides immunity for life in most people. Yellow fever has been eliminated from many areas where it once raged, but it's never been eradicated. The virus still circulates in tropical Africa and South America, maintained in a cycle between monkeys and forest mosquitoes. Occasionally, it spills over into human populations, particularly in areas where vaccination coverage is low. Outbreaks still occur. In 2016, Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo experienced major epidemics with thousands of cases. And here's the unsettling part. There's still no specific treatment for yellow fever. If you catch it today, doctors can provide supportive care, fluids, dialysis if your kidneys fail, blood transfusions if you hemorrhage. But they cannot kill the virus itself. Your survival depends entirely on whether your immune system can fight it off before your organs fail. The vaccine works brilliantly, but if you're not vaccinated and you get infected, you're facing the same odds people faced a century ago. Yellow fever taught us that disease doesn't just kill people. It can stop armies, end colonial ambitions, and prevent engineering marvels until we learn to fight the mosquito as fiercely as we fight the virus it carries. In the autumn of 1918, as World War I was finally grinding toward its bloody conclusion, another enemy emerged. This one didn't wear a uniform or carry a rifle. It didn't respect borders, treaties, or ceasefires. It was an influenza virus, and it would kill more people in 18 months than the war had killed in 4 years. Estimates range from 50 million to 100 million dead worldwide, possibly more. It was the deadliest pandemic in recorded history, and it happened just over a century ago. The 1918 influenza pandemic is often called the Spanish flu, though it almost certainly didn't originate in Spain. Spain was neutral during World War I, so its press wasn't censored and reported freely on the outbreak. Meanwhile, countries at war suppressed news of the illness to avoid damaging morale. When Spanish papers reported that even King Alfonso XIII was sick, the world started calling it the Spanish flu. Spain, understandably, called it the French flu. The truth is, no one knows exactly where it started. Some researchers think it began in Kansas, at a military base called Camp Funston. Others suspect China or France. What we do know is that the war spread it globally with unprecedented speed. Influenza itself wasn't new. Seasonal flu had always existed, killing the elderly and the very young. But this strain, later identified as H1N1, was different. It killed quickly, often within hours of the first symptoms appearing. And bizarrely, it targeted people in the prime of life, those aged 20 to 40, the demographic that normally survived influenza with ease. Pregnant women were especially vulnerable, with mortality rates as high as 70% in some areas. The virus attacked the respiratory system with overwhelming force. It started like a normal flu: fever, body aches, fatigue. But within hours, it could progress to something far worse. The lungs would fill with fluid as the immune system went into overdrive, triggering what's called a cytokine storm. Cytokines are signaling molecules that coordinate immune responses. But in a cytokine storm, the immune system essentially panics and attacks everything, including healthy tissue. The lungs became inflamed and filled with bloody fluid. Patients literally drowned in their own bodily fluids while their lungs were still in their chest. People reported feeling fine at breakfast and being dead by dinner. There are accounts of individuals collapsing on streetcars, in shops, at work, bleeding from the nose and mouth as their lungs hemorrhaged. Some turned blue or purple from lack of oxygen, a condition called cyanosis, so severe that witnesses said it was impossible to tell the race of the victims. Hospital wards filled faster than staff could keep up. Bodies accumulated in morgues faster than they could be processed. Undertakers ran out of coffin. Mass graves were dug in cities around the world.
The pandemic came in 3 waves. The first, in the spring of 1918, was relatively mild.
People got sick, some died, but it seemed like a bad flu season, nothing more. The second wave, beginning in August and peaking in the fall, was the killer. This was when the virus had mutated into its most lethal form. Mortality rates skyrocketed. In the United States alone, around 675,000 people died, more Americans than died in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. Philadelphia lost around 16,000 people in 6 months. India lost an estimated 12 to 20 million, possibly more. The third wave came in the winter and spring of 1919. It was less deadly than the second, but still killed hundreds of thousands. By the summer of 1919, the pandemic had burned itself out, likely because so many people had either died or developed immunity that the virus couldn't find enough susceptible hosts to sustain transmission. Why did it kill young, healthy adults?
The leading theory is that their robust immune systems worked against them.
When the virus infected the lungs, a strong immune system launched a massive counterattack, the cytokine storm that caused so much damage. Older adults who had weaker immune responses and who may have been exposed to a similar flu strain decades earlier often fared better. Their immune systems responded but didn't overreact. Children, whose immune systems were still developing, also had lower mortality rates than young adults. World War I played a crucial role in spreading the disease. Millions of soldiers were crammed into troop ships, trains, and trenches. Perfect conditions for respiratory viruses to spread. When soldiers returned home on leave or after the armistice, they carried the virus with them to every corner of the globe. Military censorship meant that the true scale of the outbreak was hidden from the public until it was too late to contain. There was no vaccine, no antiviral medication, no antibiotics to treat secondary bacterial pneumonia, which often finished off those whose lungs had been weakened by the virus. Doctors were helpless. They tried everything: aspirin in dangerously high doses, bloodletting, strange herbal remedies, even injections of typhoid vaccine in the desperate hope it might help somehow. Nothing worked. The virus ran its course, and all anyone could do was provide comfort and hope the patient's body was strong enough to survive. Public health measures varied wildly. Some cities closed schools, theaters, and churches. San Francisco made wearing masks mandatory in public, with fines for non-compliance. Others did nothing, either out of ignorance or because they feared economic disruption. Philadelphia held a massive war bond parade on September 28, 1918, with thousands packed together. Within days, the city's hospitals were overwhelmed, and bodies were stacked in morgues. Louis, by contrast, acted quickly, cancelling public gatherings and closing schools. Its death rate was less than half of Philadelphia's. The psychological impact was profound. After 4 years of war, people were exhausted, traumatized, and desperate for normalcy. Instead, they faced another catastrophe. The flu didn't discriminate based on nationality or loyalty. It killed soldiers and civilians, allies and enemies, rich and poor. Some historians believe the pandemic contributed to Germany's collapse and the end of the war, as both sides were so weakened by illness that continuing seemed impossible. And then it vanished. By the summer of 1919, the virus had mutated into less deadly strains or simply run out of vulnerable hosts. Life resumed, but an entire generation had been scarred. Millions of children were orphaned, families were shattered, and strangely, the pandemic was largely forgotten. It wasn't taught in schools, wasn't widely commemorated. The world wanted to move on, to forget both the war and the disease that had followed it. It wasn't until decades later that scientists were able to study the 1918 virus itself. In the 1990s, researchers recovered viral RNA from preserved tissue samples, including from a victim whose body had been buried in Alaskan permafrost. They sequenced the genome and reconstructed the virus in high-security labs to understand why it had been so deadly. What they found was a virus perfectly adapted to human hosts, with mutations that allowed it to replicate rapidly and trigger those devastating immune overreactions. The 1918 pandemic taught us that influenza should never be underestimated, that a virus can kill more people than any army, and that global catastrophes can emerge from the smallest microbes, spreading faster than fear itself. Summer was supposed to be a time of freedom for children in the 1940s and 50s. School was out, days were long, and neighborhoods filled with the sounds of kids playing in streets and swimming in public pools. But every summer brought a creeping dread that parents couldn't shake. Polio season had arrived, and no one knew who it would strike next or whether their child would be the one who woke up unable to move their legs. Poliomyelitis, caused by the poliovirus, is primarily a disease of the nervous system. The virus spreads through contaminated water and food, or through contact with infected feces. Most people who contracted polio, around 72%, never developed any symptoms at all. Their immune systems fought off the infection without them ever knowing they'd been sick. Another 24% developed mild symptoms: fever, sore throat, nausea, fatigue. They felt terrible for a few days, then recovered completely. But in about 1 to 5% of cases, the virus didn't stop there. It traveled through the bloodstream to the central nervous system, crossing the blood-brain barrier and attacking motor neurons, the nerve cells that control muscle movement. This was paralytic polio, and it struck with terrifying speed. A child could be playing normally in the morning, complain of a headache and stiff neck by afternoon, and be paralyzed by evening. The paralysis was unpredictable. Sometimes it affected just one limb, sometimes both legs. Sometimes it crept up the body, paralyzing the trunk, the arms, the muscles that controlled breathing. When the virus attacked the brainstem, causing bulbar polio, it paralyzed the muscles used for swallowing and breathing. Without mechanical assistance, patients suffocated. The mortality rate for bulbar polio was between 25 and 75%, depending on the severity and the available medical care. The iron lung became the iconic image of the polio era. These were large metal cylinders that enclosed the patient's body from the neck down. A pump created negative pressure inside the cylinder, forcing the patient's chest to expand and draw in air, then release the pressure so the chest could relax and exhale. People spent weeks, months, sometimes years inside these machines. Some never left them. They lived their entire lives from the neck up, able to see, speak, and think, but forever dependent on a machine to breathe for them. Polio had existed for millennia, but it became epidemic in the 20th century, paradoxically because of improved sanitation. In the past, when sanitation was poor and everyone was exposed to the virus as infants, most developed immunity while still protected by maternal antibodies. But as water supplies became cleaner and hygiene improved, children weren't exposed until they were older, when the virus was more likely to invade the nervous system and cause paralysis. Better sanitation created virgin populations of older children and young adults who were highly susceptible. The first major polio epidemic in the United States occurred in 1916, with over 27,000 cases and 6,000 deaths. Outbreaks became more frequent and severe through the 20s, 30s, and 40s. The 1952 epidemic was the worst, with over 57,000 cases reported, swimming pools closed, movie theaters shut down. Parents kept their children indoors, away from crowds, terrified that the next breath might carry the virus. No one understood exactly how it spread, which made the fear even worse. Some thought it was airborne, spread by breathing the same air as an infected person. Others blamed flies, dirt, or even the summer heat itself. Public health officials fumigated neighborhoods with DDT, spraying clouds of insecticide over streets and parks. Children played in the white mist, breathing it in, while their parents watched, hopefully, believing it might protect them. It didn't. The disease was particularly cruel because it targeted children, specifically those between 5 and 10 years old. Parents watched helplessly as their active, healthy children were transformed overnight into paralyzed patients. The psychological trauma was immense. Children who survived often faced years of painful physical therapy, surgeries to lengthen shortened muscles, and the lifelong burden of disability in a society that offered little accommodation. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the most famous polio survivor. He contracted the disease in 1921 at age 39 and lost the use of his legs. He spent years in rehabilitation, never regaining the ability to walk unaided, though he learned to stand using leg braces and crutches. Roosevelt went to extraordinary lengths to hide the extent of his disability from the public. Photographers were asked not to photograph him in his wheelchair. When he gave speeches, he stood, supported by aides or holding onto podiums. Most Americans never knew their president couldn't walk. Roosevelt's experience with polio made him deeply committed to finding a cure. He helped establish the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis in 1938, later known as the March of Dimes. The organization funded research, provided care for polio patients, and launched massive public fundraising campaigns. Americans donated dimes by the millions, funding the research that would eventually end the epidemic. The breakthrough came from two researchers working on competing vaccines. Jonas Salk developed an inactivated polio vaccine using killed virus to stimulate immunity without risk of infection. He tested it on himself, his wife, and his children before beginning broader trials. In 1954, the largest medical field trial in history began, involving over 1.8 million children called polio pioneers. On April 12, 1955, the results were announced. The vaccine was safe and effective, providing 80 to 90% protection against paralytic polio. The news triggered celebrations across America. Church bells rang, sirens wailed, people wept in the streets. Jonas Salk became a national hero. When asked who owned the patent to the vaccine, he famously replied, "Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" The vaccine was made available free or at minimal cost, and mass vaccination campaigns began immediately. Meanwhile, Albert Sabin was developing an oral polio vaccine using live but weakened virus. Sabin's vaccine had advantages. It was easier to administer, just drops on a sugar cube, and it provided longer-lasting immunity. It also created herd immunity more effectively because the weakened virus could spread to unvaccinated individuals without causing disease. After extensive testing, Sabin's vaccine was approved in 1961 and became the standard in most countries. The impact was almost immediate. Polio cases plummeted. By the 1970s, polio had been eliminated from the United States. By the 1990s, the Western Hemisphere was declared polio-free. The Global Polio Eradication Initiative, launched in 1988, has reduced worldwide cases by over 99.9%. Today, wild poliovirus exists in only two countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan, where conflict, distrust of vaccination, and attacks on health workers have prevented complete eradication. But the world is closer than it's ever been to eliminating polio entirely. The last cases could be prevented within years if vaccination efforts can reach every child. Polio taught us that even the most terrifying childhood diseases can be conquered, not through luck or prayer, but through scientific research, public health infrastructure, and the collective will to protect future generations from suffering. There is one disease that, even today, remains almost universally fatal once symptoms appear. No antibiotic can cure it. No antiviral can stop it. If you develop symptoms, you have roughly a week to live, and that week will be filled with confusion, terror, hallucinations, and paralysis. The disease is rabies, and it's one of humanity's oldest and most persistent nightmares. Rabies is caused by a virus from the lyssavirus genus that attacks the central nervous system. It's transmitted through the saliva of infected animals, usually through a bite, though scratches or contact with mucous membranes can also spread it. The virus doesn't move through the bloodstream. Instead, it travels along nerve pathways from the site of the bite toward the brain and spinal cord. This journey can take days, weeks, or even months, depending on how far the bite is from the central nervous system. A bite on the foot might take months to cause symptoms. A bite on the face might cause symptoms within days. During this incubation period, you feel completely normal. The virus is there, slowly making its way toward your brain, but you have no idea anything is wrong. This is the only window for treatment. Once symptoms begin, it's almost always too late, and this is why rabies is so insidious. By the time you know you're sick, you're already dying. The first symptoms are vague and easy to dismiss: fever, headache, general malaise, tingling, or burning at the site of the bite. Within days, the disease progresses to one of two forms. Furious rabies is the classic presentation, the one depicted in movies and nightmares. Patients become hyperactive, agitated, and confused. They experience episodes of extreme aggression and violence, thrashing, biting, and attacking those around them. They develop hydrophobia, an intense fear of water, not because they're thirsty, but because attempting to drink causes painful spasms of the throat muscles. Even the sight or sound of water can trigger these spasms, so patients avoid drinking despite desperate thirst. The hydrophobia comes from the virus's effect on the brain. It causes inflammation and swelling that disrupts the muscles controlling swallowing. Patients produce excessive saliva, which they cannot swallow, leading to the foaming at the mouth associated with rabies. Their pupils dilate, they hallucinate, they lose all sense of time and reality. Between episodes of fury, they may have moments of clarity where they understand what's happening to them, which makes it even more terrifying. Paralytic rabies, also called dumb rabies, is less dramatic but equally fatal. Instead of aggression, patients experience progressive muscle weakness and paralysis, starting at the site of the bite and spreading throughout the body. They become lethargic, confused, eventually comatose. This form is often misdiagnosed as Guillain-Barré syndrome or other neurological conditions, which means some rabies deaths may go unrecognized. Both forms end the same way. Within 7 to 10 days of symptom onset, coma develops, followed by respiratory failure and death. The mortality rate for symptomatic rabies is approximately 99.9%. Only a handful of people in all of recorded history have survived rabies after symptoms began, and most of them were left with severe, permanent neurological damage. Rabies has been documented for at least 4,000 years. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe mad dogs and the danger their bites posed. In ancient Greece, Aristotle wrote about rabies in animals. The Romans called it lyssa, meaning madness. Throughout history, rabid animals were feared and killed on sight, but no one understood what caused the disease or how to prevent it. The breakthrough came in 1885 when Louis Pasteur, the French microbiologist who had already revolutionized our understanding of germs, developed the first rabies vaccine. He had been studying the disease in dogs, passing the virus through rabbits to weaken it. When a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister was brought to him after being bitten 14 times by a rabid dog, Pasteur faced an agonizing decision. The boy would almost certainly die without intervention, but Pasteur's vaccine had never been tested on humans. After consulting with colleagues, Pasteur decided to proceed. Over 10 days, Joseph received 13 injections of progressively stronger preparations of the weakened virus.
Pasteur monitored him anxiously, knowing that if the treatment failed, he would have essentially killed the child. But Joseph survived.
He never developed rabies. The vaccine worked. Pasteur's method, using post-exposure vaccination to stimulate immunity before the virus reached the brain, became the standard treatment and remains so today. Modern rabies post-exposure prophylaxis involves thorough wound cleaning, followed by a series of vaccinations, and, if the exposure was severe or the patient wasn't previously vaccinated, an injection of rabies immunoglobulin around the bite wound. If started immediately after exposure and completed properly, this treatment is nearly 100% effective, but it must be started before symptoms appear. Once symptoms begin, almost nothing can be done. There is one exception, a desperate last resort protocol called the Milwaukee Protocol, developed in 2004 after a 15-year-old girl named Gianna Giza survived rabies without vaccination. The protocol involves placing the patient in a medically induced coma and administering antiviral drugs, hoping to give the immune system time to develop antibodies while protecting the brain from damage. Gianna survived and eventually recovered enough to graduate from college, though with some lasting neurological effects. Since then, the protocol has been attempted dozens of times with mixed results. A handful of patients have survived, but most have died or been left with devastating brain damage. It's not a cure. It's a desperate gamble.
Despite the existence of effective vaccines and post-exposure treatment, rabies still kills approximately 59,000 people every year,
mostly in Asia and Africa. The vast majority of cases come from dog bites in areas where canine rabies vaccination programs are inadequate or non-existent. Children are especially vulnerable because they're more likely to play with stray animals and less likely to report bites to adults. The tragedy is that almost all these deaths are preventable. Mass dog vaccination programs have eliminated canine rabies in many countries, including the United States, where most human rabies cases now come from bats, raccoons, or other wildlife. But in countries where resources are limited and millions of stray dogs roam freely, rabies persists as a constant threat, killing mostly children, mostly the poor, mostly in rural areas where access to post-exposure treatment is limited or non-existent. The World Health Organization has set a goal of 0 human rabies deaths from dog bites by 2030. Achieving this will require massive investment in dog vaccination, public education, and ensuring that post-exposure prophylaxis is available and affordable everywhere. It's an achievable goal, but only if the world decides these deaths matter enough to prevent them. Rabies reminds us that some of our oldest nightmares still lurk in the shadows, and that a disease doesn't need to be common to be absolutely terrifying when it strikes. In December of 1976, in a remote village in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, a disease emerged that seemed designed to inspire nightmares. It began with fever and headache, symptoms common enough to be dismissed. But within days, patients began bleeding from everywhere: their eyes, their gums, their nose, their rectum, internal organs liquefied. Blood vessels dissolved. The mortality rate was over 90%. The disease was named after a nearby river. Ebola. Ebola is caused by a virus, specifically one of several species in the genus Ebola virus, part of the filovirus family. Under an electron microscope, the virus looks like a piece of thread or rope, sometimes twisted into bizarre shapes. It's beautiful in a way, if you can forget what it does to human tissue. The virus targets endothelial cells, the cells that line blood vessels throughout the body. When the virus infects these cells and begins to replicate, it destroys them. Blood vessels become weak, leaky, unable to contain blood. The result is hemorrhaging, both external and internal. The disease begins 2 to 21 days after infection with sudden onset of fever, severe headache, muscle pain, and weakness. Within days, patients develop vomiting and diarrhea, often bloody, a rash appears. Then the hemorrhaging begins. Some patients bleed visibly from needle puncture sites, from their gums when they brush their teeth, from their eyes producing bloody tears. Others bleed internally, into their chest cavity, abdomen, or brain. The blood doesn't clot properly because the virus has damaged the liver and interfered with clotting factors. But not all Ebola patients bleed dramatically. In fact, massive external hemorrhaging is relatively rare, occurring in perhaps 10 to 20% of cases. More commonly, patients die from multi-organ failure as the virus destroys tissue throughout the body. The liver fails, the kidneys shut down. Blood pressure drops catastrophically as fluid leaks from damaged blood vessels into surrounding tissue. Patients go into shock and die from circulatory collapse, their bodies essentially unable to maintain the basic functions of life. What makes Ebola particularly terrifying, beyond the high mortality rate and horrific symptoms, is how it spreads. The virus is transmitted through direct contact with bodily fluids, blood, vomit, feces, saliva, sweat, breast milk, semen. You cannot catch Ebola through the air, despite what some movies suggest. But if you're caring for a sick person, washing their body, handling their soiled clothing, or preparing their body for burial, you're at extreme risk. And in many African cultures, burial rituals involve touching and washing the deceased, which means funerals became amplification events where the virus spread to multiple new victims. Healthcare workers faced impossible odds. In the early outbreaks, hospitals had limited protective equipment. Gloves, gowns, and masks were in short supply or absent entirely. Doctors and nurses tried to provide care while knowing that a single splash of contaminated fluid, a torn glove, a moment of carelessness could mean their own death. In some outbreaks, healthcare workers made up a significant percentage of the dead, sometimes 20 to 30% of all fatalities. The first recognized outbreak in 1976 killed over 280 people in Zaire and over 150 in Sudan. The virus seemed to emerge from nowhere, devastate a region, then disappear back into the forest. Scientists suspected that Ebola had an animal reservoir, some species that carried the virus without getting sick, occasionally passing it to humans who hunted or handled the animals. Fruit bats are now believed to be the primary reservoir, though the exact mechanism of transmission from bats to humans remains unclear. For decades, Ebola outbreaks were sporadic, localized, and relatively contained. The virus was so deadly that it often killed victims before they could travel far and spread it widely. Villages were quarantined, roads were blocked. The disease burned through small populations and then stopped. Between 1976 and 2014, there were approximately 24 separate Ebola outbreaks in Africa, most killing fewer than a few hundred people. Then came the West Africa epidemic of 2014 to 2016, the largest and deadliest Ebola outbreak in history. It began in Guinea in December 2013, likely when a 2-year-old boy was infected, possibly from playing near a tree inhabited by bats. He died days later. The virus spread to his family, then to healthcare workers, then to neighboring villages, then across borders into Liberia and Sierra Leone. What made this outbreak different was that it reached urban areas. Previous outbreaks had been confined to rural villages where containment, however tragic, was achievable. But when Ebola reached cities with populations in the millions, with international airports and mobile populations, the situation became catastrophic. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Bodies lay in streets because morgues were full and no one wanted to risk collecting them. Healthcare systems, already fragile in these post-conflict countries, collapsed entirely. The international response was slow and inadequate at first. By the time organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières and the World Health Organization mobilized effectively, thousands were already dead. Treatment centers were built, but they were essentially places to isolate the sick and prevent spread, not places where cure was likely. Supportive care, IV fluids, electrolyte replacement, treating secondary infections, improved survival rates somewhat, but the disease still killed roughly 50% of those infected during this outbreak. By the time the outbreak was declared over in June 2016, over 28,000 people had been infected and over 11,000 had died. The true numbers are likely higher because many deaths in remote areas were never officially recorded. Healthcare systems in the affected countries took years to recover. Economic damage ran into billions of dollars. And the psychological trauma to survivors, healthcare workers, and entire communities was immeasurable. But the 2014 outbreak also accelerated vaccine development. An experimental vaccine called RVSV-ZEBOV was tested during the outbreak using a strategy called ring vaccination, where everyone who had been in contact with an infected person and everyone in contact with those contacts received the vaccine. The results were remarkable. The vaccine was roughly 97 to 100% effective. In areas where ring vaccination was implemented, transmission chains were broken. Since then, additional vaccines have been developed and deployed during subsequent outbreaks in the Democratic Republic of Congo. These vaccines, combined with improved treatment protocols, including monoclonal antibody therapies that can neutralize the virus, have dramatically improved survival rates. In recent outbreaks, mortality rates have dropped to around 50% or lower when patients receive early treatment, a significant improvement over the 90% mortality of earlier epidemics. Ebola continues to emerge periodically, most recently in Uganda in 2022 and 2023, but the world is better prepared now than it was a decade ago. Surveillance systems are stronger, vaccines exist, treatment options are available, response times are faster. Ebola will likely never be eradicated because it persists in animal reservoirs, but it may never again kill on the scale it did in 2014. What Ebola taught us is that emerging infectious diseases remain one of humanity's greatest threats, that global health security requires investment in the poorest and most vulnerable regions, and that a virus discovered in a remote African village can, within months, become a global emergency that demands the world's attention. In June of 1981, the Centers for Disease Control published a brief report about 5 previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles who had developed a rare type of pneumonia, usually seen only in people with severely compromised immune systems. Within weeks, more cases appeared, then dozens, then hundreds. Young men, previously vibrant and healthy, were wasting away, covered in purple lesions, dying of infections that healthy immune systems should have easily fought off. No one knew what was causing it, no one knew how to stop it. And because it primarily affected gay men, many people didn't care. The disease was initially called GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, a name that reflected both the demographics of early cases and the stigma that would haunt the epidemic for decades. By late 1982, as cases appeared in hemophiliacs, injection drug users, and Haitian immigrants, the name was changed to AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, but the damage was done. In the public mind, AIDS was a gay disease, a punishment for immoral behavior, something that happened to other people, people who deserved it. AIDS is caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, which attacks and destroys CD4 T cells, a type of white blood cell crucial to immune function. These cells coordinate the body's defense against infections. They're like the generals of the immune system, directing other cells to attack invaders. HIV specifically targets them, enters them, uses their machinery to replicate itself, then destroys them in the process. Over time, as more and more CD4 cells are destroyed, the immune system collapses. A healthy person has between 500 and 1500 CD4 cells per microliter of blood. When the count drops below 200, the person is diagnosed with AIDS. At this point, the immune system can no longer protect against opportunistic infections, diseases that rarely affect healthy people but become deadly when the immune system fails. Pneumocystis pneumonia fills the lungs with fluid. Toxoplasmosis causes brain lesions. Cryptosporidiosis causes severe, uncontrollable diarrhea and wasting. Cytomegalovirus can cause blindness. One of the most visible symptoms was Kaposi's sarcoma, a cancer that causes purple or brown lesions on the skin.
Before AIDS, Kaposi's sarcoma was extremely rare, seen mainly in elderly men of Mediterranean descent.
Suddenly, young men were covered in these lesions, their faces and bodies marked by the disease in a way that made their condition impossible to hide. The lesions became a visual marker of AIDS, a scarlet letter that invited discrimination, fear, and violence. In the early 1980s, an AIDS diagnosis was a death sentence. There was no treatment, only supportive care while patients wasted away. The average time from AIDS diagnosis to death was about 18 months, though some died within weeks. Patients lost massive amounts of weight, their bodies consuming themselves. They developed dementia as the virus attacked the brain. They went blind, lost the ability to walk, became incontinent, and through it all, they faced not just a medical crisis, but a social one. Families rejected their dying sons and brothers. Landlords evicted them. Employers fired them. Healthcare workers refused to treat them, terrified of contagion despite evidence that HIV couldn't be transmitted through casual contact. Funeral homes refused to handle their bodies. Some patients died alone, abandoned by everyone they'd known, their bodies left unclaimed. The stigma was, in some ways, as deadly as the virus itself, because it prevented education, research, funding, and compassionate care. The Reagan administration was silent for years, while thousands died. President Reagan didn't publicly mention AIDS until 1985, 4 years into the epidemic, and didn't give a major speech about it until 1987, by which time over 20,000 Americans had died. Funding for research was inadequate. Public health campaigns were blocked by officials who believed that educating people about safe sex would promote immorality. Blood banks were slow to screen donations, leading to thousands of hemophiliacs and transfusion recipients becoming infected. The gay community responded with extraordinary courage and creativity. Organizations like Gay Men's Health Crisis and ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, formed to provide care for the sick, advocate for research funding, and demand government action. ACT UP's protests were confrontational and impossible to ignore. Die-ins on the steps of the FDA, demonstrations that shut down Wall Street, ashes of loved ones scattered on the White House lawn. Their slogan, "Silence equals death," captured the urgency and rage of a community watching itself be decimated while the world looked away. In 1983, researchers at the Pasteur Institute in France and the National Cancer Institute in the United States independently identified HIV as the cause of AIDS. This was a crucial step, but identification didn't lead immediately to treatment. Throughout the 1980s, doctors could only treat the opportunistic infections, not the underlying virus. Patients cycled through hospitals, recovering from one infection only to develop another, each one taking more of their strength. The first antiretroviral drug, AZT, was approved in 1987. It was better than nothing, but barely. AZT slowed viral replication, but had severe side effects and often stopped working as the virus developed resistance. Patients took handfuls of pills daily, experienced nausea, anemia, and muscle wasting, and still died, just slightly more slowly. The breakthrough came in the mid-1990s with the development of protease inhibitors and combination antiretroviral therapy, known as highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HAART. By combining 3 or more drugs that attacked HIV at different points in its replication cycle, doctors could suppress the virus to undetectable levels. Patients who had been wasting away, preparing to die, suddenly began to recover. Their CD4 counts rose, opportunistic infections cleared, they gained weight, returned to work, resumed their lives. By 1996, AIDS deaths in the United States had dropped by 47%. The Lazarus effect, they called it, as people rose from what had seemed like deathbeds. But this miracle was limited to those who could access treatment, primarily in wealthy countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, where the epidemic was devastating entire nations, antiretroviral drugs remained out of reach for most. Millions continued to die. Today, HIV is considered a manageable chronic condition for those with access to treatment. Modern antiretroviral regimens often involve just 1 or 2 pills per day with minimal side effects.
People with well-controlled HIV have normal life expectancies.
And crucially, when viral load is suppressed to undetectable levels, HIV cannot be transmitted sexually. Undetectable equals untransmittable. U equals U has become a rallying cry, liberating people with HIV from the fear of infecting partners. Pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, a pill taken daily by HIV-negative people at high risk, is over 99% effective at preventing infection. New injectable forms last for months. We have the tools to end new HIV infections if we can overcome barriers of cost, access, stigma, and political will. But HIV hasn't been cured, and it hasn't been eradicated. Nearly 39 million people worldwide are living with HIV. In 2022, 630,000 people died of AIDS-related illnesses, and 1.3 million were newly infected. The epidemic continues, particularly affecting marginalized communities, gay and bisexual men, transgender women, people who inject drugs, sex workers, and in some regions, adolescent girls and young women. The AIDS crisis taught us that disease doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by politics, economics, and prejudice. It showed us that stigma can be as deadly as any virus, and that activism, loud, angry, insistent activism, can change the course of an epidemic and save lives. Of all the diseases that have plagued humanity, malaria holds a unique and terrible distinction. It has killed more people throughout history than any other single disease. More than plague, more than smallpox, more than all the wars ever fought. Conservative estimates suggest malaria has killed half of all humans who have ever lived. Half. It's an almost incomprehensible number, billions of deaths stretching back thousands of years, and the disease is still with us, still killing, still shaping where and how people can live. Malaria isn't caused by a virus or bacterium. It's caused by parasites, single-celled organisms from the genus Plasmodium. 5 species can infect humans, but 2 are responsible for most cases. Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest, and Plasmodium vivax, the most widespread. The parasites are transmitted through the bite of female Anopheles mosquitoes, which need blood meals to nourish their eggs. When an infected mosquito bites you, it injects sporozoites, the infective form of the parasite, into your bloodstream, along with its saliva. The sporozoites travel to your liver, where they invade liver cells and begin reproducing. Over 7 to 10 days, a single sporozoite can produce tens of thousands of merozoites, the next stage of the parasite. These merozoites burst out of the liver cells and enter the bloodstream, where they invade red blood cells. Inside the red blood cells, they feed on hemoglobin, multiply, and eventually burst out, destroying the cell in the process and releasing more merozoites to invade more red blood cells. This cycle repeats every 48 to 72 hours, depending on the species. When the infected red blood cells burst, they release not just more parasites, but also cellular debris and toxic byproducts into the bloodstream. This triggers the immune system, causing the classic symptoms of malaria: sudden onset of high fever, violent shaking chills, profuse sweating, headache, muscle aches, and fatigue. The fever follows a cyclical pattern, spiking every 2 or 3 days as synchronized waves of parasites burst from red blood cells. Between fever episodes, patients may feel relatively normal, which can lead them to underestimate the severity of the disease. But malaria is far from benign. As red blood cells are destroyed, patients develop anemia, which causes weakness, shortness of breath, and pale skin. The spleen enlarges as it works overtime to filter out damaged red blood cells. In severe cases, particularly with Plasmodium falciparum, infected red blood cells become sticky and clump together, blocking small blood vessels. When this happens in the brain, it causes cerebral malaria, characterized by seizures, confusion, coma, and often death. When it happens in the placenta of pregnant women, it can cause miscarriage, stillbirth, or low birth weight. Children under 5 are especially vulnerable. Their immune systems haven't developed resistance, and severe malaria can progress rapidly. A child can seem only mildly ill in the morning and be comatose by evening. Severe anemia, respiratory distress, and cerebral malaria kill hundreds of thousands of children every year, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, where malaria transmission is intense and year-round. Malaria has shaped human history in profound ways. The disease is endemic in tropical and subtropical regions where Anopheles mosquitoes thrive. This geography has influenced everything from where civilizations developed to the outcomes of wars. Ancient Rome was plagued by malaria from the surrounding swamps. The The disease contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire as populations weakened and agricultural productivity dropped. Malaria helped defeat European colonial armies in Africa and Asia, killing soldiers faster than local resistance could. The name itself comes from medieval Italian mala aria, meaning bad air. People believed the disease was caused by miasma, poisonous vapors rising from swamps. They were wrong about the mechanism, but right about the association with wetlands, which are prime mosquito breeding grounds. It wasn't until 1880 that French physician Charles Louis Alphonse Laveran discovered parasites in the blood of malaria patients, proving it was an infectious disease. And it wasn't until 1897 that British physician Ronald Ross proved that mosquitoes transmitted the parasites, work for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1902. Treatment for malaria has existed for centuries, though its effectiveness has varied. Indigenous peoples in South America discovered that the bark of the cinchona tree could treat fever. The bark contains quinine, a compound that kills malaria parasites. Jesuit missionaries brought cinchona bark to Europe in the 1600s, where it became known as Jesuits' bark or Peruvian bark. Quinine became the standard malaria treatment for over 300 years and is still used today, though synthetic drugs have largely replaced it. During World War II, when Japan captured the cinchona-growing regions of Southeast Asia, the Allies desperately needed alternative anti-malarial drugs. This led to the development of chloroquine, which was cheaper, more effective, and easier to produce than quinine. Chloroquine became the backbone of malaria treatment and prevention for decades. Combined with widespread spraying of the insecticide DDT to kill mosquitoes, chloroquine contributed to malaria being eliminated from Europe, North America, and other temperate regions by the 1960s. There was genuine hope that malaria could be eradicated globally, but the parasites evolved. Chloroquine-resistant strains of Plasmodium falciparum emerged in Southeast Asia and spread to Africa. DDT resistance developed in mosquito populations. And crucially, funding and political will for eradication efforts waned as wealthier countries, no longer affected by the disease, lost interest. Malaria rebounded in many regions, and the dream of eradication faded. Today, we have better tools than ever before. Artemisinin-based combination therapies, derived from a traditional Chinese medicinal plant, are the current standard treatment and are highly effective, though resistance is beginning to emerge in some areas. Insecticide-treated bed nets provide physical barriers against nighttime biting mosquitoes and kill those that land on them. Indoor residual spraying targets mosquitoes where they rest after feeding. Rapid diagnostic tests allow for quick, accurate diagnosis even in remote areas without laboratory facilities. In 2021, the World Health Organization approved the first malaria vaccine, RTS-S, for use in children in high transmission areas. The vaccine provides partial protection, reducing severe malaria by about 30%. It's not perfect, but combined with other prevention methods, it saves lives. A second vaccine, R21, has shown even higher efficacy in trials and may be approved soon. Despite these advances, malaria still kills. In 2021, there were an estimated 247 million cases and 619,000 deaths, mostly children under 5 in Africa. That's one child dying of malaria every minute, and these numbers likely underestimate the true burden, as many cases and deaths in remote areas go unreported. The economic impact is staggering. Countries with high malaria burdens spend billions on treatment and prevention. Productivity is lost as workers fall ill. Children miss school, affecting their education and future prospects. Tourism and foreign investment are discouraged. Malaria traps communities in cycles of poverty, as those too sick to work can't earn money, can't afford treatment, and become sicker. Eliminating malaria is theoretically possible. It's been done in many countries, but it requires sustained funding, political commitment, strong health systems, and communities working together. It requires mosquito control, access to diagnosis and treatment, preventive measures like bed nets, and surveillance systems to detect and respond to outbreaks quickly. In wealthy countries, these things are achievable. In the poorest regions where malaria hits hardest, they remain frustratingly out of reach. Malaria reminds us that the deadliest diseases aren't always the ones that make headlines, and that ancient enemies can persist for millennia if we don't maintain the will to fight them. So, you've made it through the Black Death, smallpox, leprosy, tuberculosis, cholera, typhus, syphilis, yellow fever, influenza, polio, rabies, Ebola, HIV, and malaria. You've walked through centuries of suffering, watched diseases hollow out cities and devastate continents, seen humanity at its most vulnerable and most resilient. And if you're still listening, still breathing, still comfortable in your bed with your antibiotics within reach, and your vaccines coursing through your bloodstream, then you've already won a lottery your ancestors couldn't even imagine. Every disease we've discussed tonight reshaped the world in fundamental ways. The Black Death killed so many people that it broke the feudal system, raised wages for survivors, and helped spark the Renaissance. Smallpox emptied the Americas and made European colonization possible. Tuberculosis filled sanatoriums and inspired the Romantic movement's obsession with beautiful, tragic death. Cholera forced cities to build modern water and sewage systems. Influenza showed us that pandemics could emerge suddenly and kill millions before anyone understood what was happening. But these diseases also drove humanity to fight back with everything we had. We developed germ theory, learning that invisible microorganisms caused illness. We created vaccines, training our immune systems to recognize threats before they could harm us. We discovered antibiotics, chemical weapons that could kill bacteria without killing us. We built public health infrastructure, sanitation systems, hospitals, disease surveillance networks. We launched global campaigns to eradicate smallpox and nearly eliminate polio. We turned HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. Each victory came at tremendous cost. Millions died before we understood what was killing them. Millions more died while we searched for treatments. The path from disease to cure is paved with failed experiments, discarded theories, and countless bodies. But we kept trying, we kept learning, and slowly, painfully, we pushed back the darkness. Think about what your body does automatically that would have been miraculous a century ago. You got a cut last week and didn't die of sepsis because your skin heals and your immune system fights off bacteria. You drank tap water this morning without worrying about cholera because someone built a water treatment plant. You haven't had polio because someone gave you a vaccine when you were a child. You won't get smallpox because humanity eradicated it entirely. You probably won't get tuberculosis, and if you do, you'll take antibiotics for 6 months and recover completely. Your body is not invincible. It's still vulnerable to cancer, heart disease, accidents, and aging. But you live in the safest time in human history when it comes to infectious disease. The invisible threats that terrorized every generation before yours have been largely tamed, not eliminated, not conquered completely, but understood, treatable, often preventable. This doesn't mean we're done fighting. New diseases will emerge. We've already seen it with COVID-19, a novel coronavirus that swept the globe in 2020 and killed millions despite all our modern medicine and technology. We'll see it again with the next pandemic, whatever that turns out to be. Antibiotic resistance is growing, threatening to make common bacterial infections deadly again. Climate change is expanding the range of mosquito-borne diseases like malaria and dengue. Political instability and poverty continue to prevent vaccines and treatments from reaching everyone who needs them. But we have tools our ancestors never dreamed of. We can sequence a virus's genome in days and design vaccines in months. We can track disease outbreaks in real time using global surveillance networks. We can manufacture billions of doses of medication and distribute them worldwide. We understand how diseases spread and how to interrupt transmission. We know that clean water, adequate nutrition, and basic sanitation prevent more deaths than almost any medical intervention. The diseases we've discussed tonight aren't just history. They're still with us, still killing people, primarily in the poorest parts of the world where access to healthcare is limited and where the basic infrastructure we take for granted doesn't exist. Tuberculosis kills over 1 million people every year. Malaria kills over 600,000. HIV continues to spread. Cholera outbreaks follow every natural disaster and conflict. The suffering hasn't ended. It's just moved somewhere we don't have to see it every day. And that's perhaps the most important lesson from tonight's journey. Disease has never been just a biological problem. It's a social, economic, and political problem. Who gets sick and who survives has always been determined by wealth, power, and privilege. The rich have always had better access to clean water, nutritious food, medical care, and safe living conditions. The poor have always died in greater numbers from diseases that are preventable and treatable. This pattern continues today. You can survive HIV in a wealthy country with access to antiretroviral therapy. You'll die in a poor country without it. You can prevent malaria with bed nets, medications, and mosquito control, but only if someone provides them. You can survive Ebola if you reach a treatment center with trained staff and supportive care, but not if the nearest center is a 3-day walk through the jungle. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your clean bed, in your temperature-controlled room, with modern medicine available if you need it, take a moment to feel grateful. Grateful for the researchers who spent their lives studying diseases, grateful for the activists who fought for funding and treatment access, grateful for the public health workers who built the systems that protect us, grateful for the vaccines you received as a child, the antibiotics you can take when you're sick, the clean water flowing from your tap. Your ancestors survived plague, smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis, and countless other diseases so that you could be here tonight. They endured suffering we can barely imagine. They watched their children die of illnesses we now prevent with simple vaccines. They lived in fear of invisible threats they couldn't understand or control. And through sheer biological luck, through the random chance of having immune systems that could fight off infection or simply not being in the wrong place at the wrong time, some of them survived long enough to have children, who had children, who eventually had you. Every breath you take is a gift. Every morning you wake up healthy is a victory. Every year you live past childhood is a triumph over the diseases that once killed half of all children before their 5th birthday. You are the descendant of survivors, and you live in an age of miracles that your ancestors would have considered impossible. So, rest now. Let your body repair itself while you sleep. fighting off the minor infections and cellular damage that accumulate during the day, processes so routine you don't even notice them happening. Your immune system is working right now, silently, efficiently, protecting you from threats you'll never know existed. It's a system refined by millions of years of evolution and supported by centuries of medical progress. And it's yours, keeping you alive, keeping you healthy, giving you the chance to wake up tomorrow and live another day in the safest, healthiest time in human history. Sleep well, knowing that the worst diseases humanity has ever faced are behind us, and that we're better prepared than ever for whatever comes next. We started tonight in the year 1348, watching the Black Death arrive on ships with dead crews and rats in the hold. We've traveled through centuries of suffering, walked alongside people dying of diseases they couldn't understand, couldn't prevent, and couldn't cure. We've seen bodies piled in streets, children paralyzed overnight, young adults drowning in their own lungs, and communities torn apart by invisible enemies smaller than a single cell. And now, here you are, still breathing, still safe, still tucked into a bed that isn't infested with plague fleas or typhus-carrying lice. Your water won't give you cholera. Your mosquito bite won't give you yellow fever or malaria. The cough you had last week wasn't tuberculosis, and even if it had been, you could have walked into a clinic, gotten tested, received antibiotics, and been cured within months. The miracle isn't just that you're alive. It's that staying alive has become so routine, so expected, that you probably don't think about it at all. Your body, right now, as you listen to this, is performing operations that would have seemed like divine intervention to your ancestors. Your immune system is patrolling your bloodstream, identifying and destroying potential threats before they can take hold. Your skin is healing microscopic damage from today's activities. Your lymph nodes are filtering out bacteria and viruses you encountered without even knowing it. Your white blood cells are multiplying, differentiating, learning to recognize new pathogens so that if you encounter them again, your body will respond faster and more effectively. And while you sleep tonight, that work continues. Sleep isn't just rest. It's when your immune system does some of its most important maintenance. During deep sleep, your body produces cytokines, proteins that help fight infection and inflammation. It generates T cells and B cells, the specialized immune cells that remember pathogens and coordinate attacks against them. It strengthens the connections between your immune cells, making your entire defense system more efficient. People who don't get enough sleep have weaker immune responses. They get sick more often, recover more slowly, and respond less effectively to vaccines. So, in a very real sense, the sleep you're about to have isn't just about feeling rested tomorrow. It's about giving your body the time it needs to maintain the defenses that keep you alive. Your ancestors didn't have vaccines or antibiotics, but they had immune systems, the same basic biological machinery you have now. And those immune systems, working alone without any help from modern medicine, kept them alive just long enough to reproduce, to pass their genes forward, until eventually those genes reached you. Every person whose story we told tonight, everyone who died of plague or smallpox or cholera or any of the other diseases, they had immune systems too. But their immune systems were overwhelmed by pathogens that replicated too fast, released too many toxins, or exploited vulnerabilities that evolution hadn't yet prepared them for. The difference between survival and death often came down to tiny variations in immune response, random genetic differences that meant one person's body could fight off an infection that killed their neighbor. You exist because your ancestors were, in some small way, lucky. Lucky to have the right genes, lucky to avoid exposure at the wrong time, lucky to live in the right place, lucky to survive childhood, lucky to survive childbirth, lucky to survive the countless infections that could have ended their bloodlines before you ever had a chance to exist. And now you're here, benefiting not just from that biological luck, but from centuries of human knowledge, accumulated slowly, painfully, through trial and error and the deaths of millions. The scientists who discovered germ theory, who developed vaccines, who created antibiotics, who built public health systems, they weren't working in abstract. They were motivated by the suffering they saw around them. They watched children die of preventable diseases. They saw young adults waste away from tuberculosis. They witnessed epidemics devastate communities. And they decided to fight back with the only weapons they had: observation, experimentation, and the stubborn human refusal to accept that death was inevitable. Every medical advance we discussed tonight came from someone asking a simple question: does it have to be this way? Does cholera have to kill half the people it infects? Or could we find the source and stop transmission? Does polio have to paralyze children? Or could we create a vaccine? Does HIV have to be a death sentence? Or could we develop drugs that suppress the virus? And in almost every case, the answer was no. It doesn't have to be this way. We can do better. But doing better required more than just scientific genius. It required public health infrastructure, political will, funding, and the collective decision that human life mattered enough to invest in protecting it. It required people who were willing to test vaccines on themselves, who traveled to epidemic zones knowing they might not return, who fought against stigma and discrimination to ensure that everyone, not just the wealthy, had access to life-saving treatments. The diseases we've discussed tonight aren't ancient history. They're still here. Tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, cholera, rabies, all of them are still killing people right now, primarily in places where poverty, conflict, or inadequate infrastructure prevent access to the treatments and prevention methods that could save them. The tools exist, the knowledge exists. What's often missing is the resources and the will to deploy them where they're needed most. So, yes, you should feel grateful that you live in a time and place where infectious diseases are largely controlled, but you should also feel responsible. The same scientific progress that protects you could protect everyone if we chose to make it available. Vaccines cost pennies per dose to manufacture, but remain out of reach for millions of children. Antibiotics that could cure tuberculosis in 6 months are unavailable in areas where the disease kills thousands. Bed nets that prevent malaria cost just a few dollars, but aren't distributed to everyone who needs them. The privilege of living in the safest time in human history comes with an obligation to support the research that continues to develop new treatments, to advocate for global health equity, to understand that disease doesn't respect borders and that an outbreak anywhere is a threat everywhere, to appreciate the vaccines and public health measures that protect us, even when they seem inconvenient, and to remember that the diseases that feel like distant history to you are immediate, terrifying reality to millions of people who are just as human, just as deserving of protection as you are. Tonight, as you fall asleep, you're not just resting your body. You're participating in a biological process that has kept humans alive for hundreds of thousands of years. Your immune system is working. Your cells are repairing damage. Your brain is consolidating memories and processing the information you absorb today. And all of this is happening automatically, without you having to think about it, protected by knowledge that didn't exist a few generations ago. So close your eyes breathe deeply. Let your body do what it evolved to do, supported by the accumulated wisdom of centuries of human effort. You are safe, you are protected, you are the beneficiary of countless sacrifices made by people who came before you, who suffered so that you wouldn't have to, who died so that you could learn from their deaths and build something better. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you live in an age of miracles. And when you wake up tomorrow, healthy and rested and alive, maybe take a moment to consider what you can do to extend those miracles to the people who still desperately need them. Because the fight against disease isn't over. It's just moved to places where we don't always see it. And those invisible battles are still being fought right now by people who deserve the same chance at health, at safety, at long life that you have tonight. Thank you for joining me on this journey through humanity's darkest medical history. If you found value in tonight's exploration, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with someone who might appreciate a different kind of bedtime story. And if you're comfortable, leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what disease from tonight's discussion surprised you most. I read every comment, and I'm always curious about what resonates with people across the globe. Now rest. Let history fade into sleep, and wake tomorrow with a renewed appreciation for the extraordinary, improbable gift of simply being alive and well in the modern world. Good night.